Now going back to these three different pathways that we can see side by side, you'll notice that the spinothalamic and the posterior column all have this funny little character here. We refer to this as the homunculus, which means little man. This is kind of giving you a mapping of the amount of the primary somatosensory cortex that is going to be devoted to that particular part of the body. So notice in here you have your face with your lips are very large, and then you do have some smaller aspects there, but then you have your hand with your fingers that are going to be the most sensitive. So anything that has more sensitivity is generally going to have a larger part of the cerebral cortex that's going to be dedicated to processing that sensation. Now moving on to our posterior column pathway. Notice our posterior column pathway is of course coming in through the dorsal root, and then it's going to come in here, and then you're going to have this pathway that's going to be in the posterior columns, which are going to take the information up. So as you can see, we're going to have our first order neuron that goes into the spinal cord. And then we're going to take that first order neuron, go all the way up until we're getting to the medulla oblongata. Notice that our second order neuron is going to decussate, cross over here in the medulla oblongata area. And then it's going to go up to the midbrain before it's going to be processed and going through the third order neuron all the way to our somatosensory cortex of our cerebrum. So this one is going to particularly pick up sensations like your fine touch instead of crude touch, vibration, pressure, and your sense of proprioception. So those are going to be those particular stimuli picked up by the receptor going in through our dorsal root here, going up through our spinal cord, and then it's going to cross over or decussate into the medulla oblongata area and then go all the way up before it's going to our primary somatosensory cortex. Our spinocerebellar pathway is going to be taking information that's about our proprioception. So it's figuring out our position of our skeletal muscles or tendons in our joints, and then it's going to be taking that information to the cerebellum as opposed to the cerebrum that we saw earlier. So we can see our receptors are picking up information coming in through the dorsal root, and we have our first order neuron shown here in red bringing the information into our spinal cord. From there, we can have decussation that can happen twice in the spinocerebellar pathway, or not at all. So it just depends on the information that you're getting. So you can have things coming in here, and then notice coming upward through the medulla oblongata, this is going to be our second order neuron, and that second order neuron is then going to synapse directly into the cerebellum. In our spinal cerebellar pathway, we don't have a third order neuron. The second order neuron is the one that's going to be synapsing within the cerebellum. Because of this, you don't have conscious awareness of these signals. These signals are coming in and helping you to coordinate how your body moves, but you're not thinking about this at all because you only have that first order neuron taking the information into the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord, the second order neuron is taking it to the cerebellum. Now, I'm not going to specifically look at this chart in terms of trying to get test questions from it, but it does give you a nice breakdown of all the different pathways and the different pieces of it, the different sensations or stimuli that we're going to be receiving in our somatic sensory pathway, and then where the first, second, and third order neurons are going to be happening and where they're synapsing, and then where the cell bodies are going to be as well. So when we entered with that third order neuron that was going to the cerebrum and that cerebral cortex, we were going to process that information within the brain itself. Now, if we need to respond to that, we are going to send motor commands down the somatic motor pathways, and that's what we're looking at here. So we can see that same section of the spinal cord, and then we have three different pathways that we see shown here that are motor pathways now. We have the corticospinal pathway, the lateral pathway, and the medial pathway. When we're talking about the somatic pathway, this is controlling our skeletal muscles. This can be a conscious or a subconscious motor command depending on what kind of information your brain is going to be sending. Now, we don't refer to first, second, and third order neurons in your motor pathways. In your somatic motor pathway, we have both an upper and a lower motor neuron. Our upper motor neuron is going to be housed with its cell body within that cerebral cortex that we just talked about that was processing the information. So now we're sending the information down from the cerebral cortex, and then it will synapse with a lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron is going to be the one that extends all the way down to the skeletal muscle to innervate that motor unit within the skeletal muscle to cause the contraction. Now looking specifically at our corticospinal pathway, notice we have our lateral as well as our anterior tracts of them. Again, we're looking at our white matter columns and tracts. The corticospinal pathway is going to control your skeletal muscles. We have a motor homunculus just like we had a sensory one. So here you can see the relative density and distribution of the primary cortex that's going to be devoted to each of these different sections. And the tongue is killing me on this one. So you can see all the different parts and the densities of them. Here we can see that upper and lower motor neuron that I was just talking about. So within that primary motor cortex, you're going to have that first upper motor neuron that's taking the information downward until you get to the lower motor neuron. Then the lower motor neuron is going to innervate with your skeletal muscles. Now notice our two different tracts that we have, both the lateral and the anterior tract, are going to be taking information through the somatic motor pathway. Now looking at it, we have our motor neuron that's coming down here, that's our upper motor neuron, and it can cross over in the midbrain, it can cross over in different parts of the brain stem, or it can cross over later on within the spinal cord. It just depends on where that signal is going to need to go. So the different pathways that you have, so notice when we have it coming down here, we're going through this anterior part of it, keeping going down to the anterior, and then we decussate here in the medulla oblongata shown here, and now we're coming in through the lateral corticospinal tract. Then it will take that information to the skeletal muscles. So we can see the two different pathways being involved with that signal that generated from the primary motor cortex to begin with. Now these other two pathways we're not going to go into as much detail, but looking at the lateral pathway, this is going to control our muscle tone and movements of the distal limb muscles that are performing very precise movements, where you're looking at the medial pathway here, and that's going to also control muscle tone and gross movements, but this is of the trunk and the proximal limb muscles. So when you think about the limbs are going to be controlled by both the pathways, depending on whether it's close to the body, which is going to be the medial, or if it's going to be the farther end, which is going to be our lateral pathway. Chapter 15 was all about the somatic nervous system. Now we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system and then higher order functions of the brain. Quick recap of what we saw with the somatic nervous system. In the somatic nervous system, you have both the upper and the lower motor neurons. Those upper and lower motor neurons are going to be allowing us to take information from our brain within our cerebral cortex and innervate our skeletal muscles for our voluntary muscle control. Now, when we're comparing that to the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is going to be where you have your parasympathetic and your sympathetic that's going to be causing the effectors within your viscera to actually be contracting and responding. We don't refer to them as having upper and lower motor neurons. They instead are going to have preganglionic neurons and then postganglionic neurons. So there's structurally going to be a difference that we see here. The preganglionic, you can see up here at the top and then down here lower, those preganglionic neurons are going to have their cell bodies that are housed within either the brainstem or the spinal cord. And then what you're going to look at after that, they synapse with a postganglionic. So of course, in the middle we have ganglionic neuron there. So the ganglionic neuron and then postganglionic, the cell bodies are going to be housed within that area for the autonomic ganglia, and then they're going to go to the different organs, glands, or smooth muscles that they're going to control. Now this should be a little bit of a review because we talked about the divisions of the autonomic nervous system in a previous chapter where we have both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. Both of them are going to have basically the same target organs at the end, and they're going to be controlling our viscera, but what you can see is structurally they're going to be very different, and how they act is going to be different. So when we call the sympathetic division the fight or flight, this is because it's going to be in response to stress or some sort of emergency. The whole purpose is to increase your alertness, your respiratory rate, your metabolic rate, and your muscular abilities by activating the sympathetic. Parasympathetic, on the other hand, we refer to as rest and digest because it conserves energy and maintains the resting metabolic rate. Now, they're going to have opposing effects of each other. So while that sympathetic division was going to be very stimulating, the parasympathetic is going to do things like decreasing your metabolic rate, decreasing your heart rate and your blood pressure, increasing salivary gland secretions and your digestive glands, increasing motility and blood flow to your digestive tract, and stimulating things like urination and defecation. Generally speaking, though, most of your vital organs are going to be innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which we refer to as dual innervation. So most of your vital organs are going to have this dual innervation where you're going to have opposing effects from the two different ones. Now, the parasympathetic postganglionic fibers are traveling by the cranial nerves to all those peripheral destinations. The sympathetic innervations reaches the same structures, but it's going to be doing it from a superior cervical ganglia chain. You have a bunch of autonomic plexuses. Remember, plexus is just going to be some sort of interweaving network. We have nerve networks in the thoracic and abdominal cavities that are going to form the sympathetic postganglionic fibers and parasympathetic preganglionic fibers, and they travel with blood and lymphatic vessels that are all supplying the visceral organs. So structurally looking over here, sympathetic division, you can see the thoracolumbar division. It's called that because when you're seeing the different places that the nerves are coming in, we can see that our preganglionic are really going to be housed down here in that thoracic and lumbar region of our spinal cord, where that preganglionic is coming in from those different sections right here in that midsection. Parasympathetic, though, is referred to as craniosacral because you can see the preganglionic neurons are going to be coming from the cranium area down here and the brainstem, as well as from the sacrum division. So structurally, they are going to be very different from each other. We can see that the preganglionic on the parasympathetic is going to be very, very long. And then if you look at it over here in the sympathetic, the preganglionic is actually pretty short, and the postganglionic is going to be long. This slide is going to give us a good comparison of that somatic and the autonomic nervous systems that we've been talking about. Notice here in the center, we are going to have our sensory receptors that are picking up all this information. It's going through our sensory pathways, and then from those sensory pathways, we're going to relay and process information in our brainstem, thalamus and hypothalamus. There's our diencephalon, and then our cerebral cortex taking in that information. Now, from the cerebral cortex, if we want motor information, if we're talking about the somatic nervous system, it is going to send that down through your upper and then lower motor neurons to your skeletal muscles to control our voluntary contractions. If we're talking about our autonomic, the autonomic system is going to be a little bit different because really it's controlled by the hypothalamus and the brainstem, very little from the cerebral cortex per se. So the hypothalamus and the brainstem are going to be sending that information downward from the preganglionic and then the ganglionic neurons that are going to cause our viscera to have the response that we're looking for. Now, in looking at the autonomic system, notice we're going to rely on a lot of reflexes. So our sensory receptors are going to send signals directly to these ganglionic neurons as well that are going to cause effects. Again, sensory pathway bringing up, and then you have lung effects as well. So we have a lot of parallels in both the organization and function, but they're going to have integration somewhere that's a little bit different. So we're going to have the brainstem and the ANS that's really doing a lot of the control plus the diencephalon, whereas the cerebral cortex is giving us all that information for the skeletal muscles. When we talk about a reflex, remember we had reflex arcs before when we were talking about spinal nerves. These reflex arcs are going to consist of, again, a receptor, a sensory neuron, and then some processing center, which is going to be interneurons, and then you're going to have your preganglionic and postganglionic neurons again to cause some sort of effect. Now, long reflexes that we see are going to coordinate the activities of the whole organ and how it's going to function. Short reflexes, on the other hand, so not regulating the whole organ, but one particular activity. So sensory neurons are going to pick up that information. The interneurons are going to have cell bodies inside the autonomic ganglia. And then from there, the interneurons are going to synapse with the postganglionic neurons. And so directly from the interneurons within the autonomic ganglia, you're going to have the postganglionic neurons that are going to cause the effects.